So, most welcome to this new episode with the State of Affairs. I am Maharajuddin Bhatt and I am an international politics student. We have a very special guest today, and I'm already running late a couple of minutes because we got a technical issue with this. So, he's somebody, Professor Harshvi Pant. He's Director Studies and Head of the Strategic Studies program at Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi. He holds a joint appointment with the Department of Defense Studies and King's India Institute as Professor of International Relations at King's College London. He has been a visiting professor of Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, a visiting fellow at the Center for Advanced Study of India, University of Pennsylvania, and University of Melbourne. He is also a non-resident fellow with the Wadhwani Chair in US-India Policy Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Washington, D.C. So he has some of the great publications to his credit. I'll just name a few of them. New Directions in Indian Foreign Policy, Theory and Praxis, India's Nuclear Policy, the US Pivot and Indian Foreign Policy, Handbook of Indian Defense Policy, India's Afghan Muddle, US-India Nuclear Pact, Policy Process and Great Power Politics. He also writes regularly for various international media outlets, including Japan Times, the Wall Street Journal, National, UAE, Hindustan Times, and Telegraph. So quickly, I'll just welcome Mr. Professor Harshvi Pant, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So before going to the session, I'll just draw a landscape of what a professor is going to talk about. It will be about the pandemic and its impact on the changing geopolitics of the global order. And then we'll be talking about India-China relations specifically. And then we'll be talking about India and West Asia, and especially we'll be talking about India and US in the changing millennium. So, Professor, the things that we have at the hand is that due to this pandemic, we have all the economies around the globe that have taken a very, big hit. We have massive casualties around the globe, and then we are in the middle of the second wave in India. Whole of the healthcare infrastructure across the countries have perished that way. They are overwhelmed, and then we have issues with that will trickle down to the economies of the world. Sir, I'll just have your take on the overall scenario about what's happening around the world due to this pandemic, sir.
Thank you, Mehraj. I think, what is happening, or what seems to have happened, is that we started off with a, this is primarily a health crisis, which has morphed now, or is morphing into a wealth crisis. So you had the public health issues coming to the forefront over the last 1 year and 1.5 years, and now its impact on state capacities across the world to generate wealth is coming under question. So most major is, if you look at, for example, India has just formalized its GDP growth rate, which has come out. And we are being told that this is one of the biggest slumps we have seen in our GDP over the last year. Though gradually the last 2 quarters of last year, financial year, have been better. But, you just have to look at the impact that the sudden decline over the last year will have on India, on Indians, and on the capacity of Indian state to do all the kinds of things that it is supposed to do. But this is a story across the world. So you look at some of the wealthiest countries in the world who have been unable to cope with this crisis. I think in India, for example, the first wave, it did not have that kind of an impact that the second wave is having. But if you just go back to Europe in the first wave, or America in the first wave, it was devastating. I mean, the kind of numbers, the kind of deaths, the kind of pressure on health systems that I think the world took for granted. Who thought that Western countries would be facing a health crisis, which reminded countries of third world that look at the number of deaths in America, look at the way health infrastructure completely collapsed. So clearly, what it has done is that this crisis has revealed some of the fundamental challenges that all nations are facing across the world. And this crisis, I think, unfortunately, is not over yet. We are in the second wave. People are talking about a third wave. Who knows how the infection is going to spread around the world? Different variants are coming, mutations are coming. So I think there is a level of uncertainty which is quite unprecedented. And when you have uncertainty, you also don't see wealth generation. Investors are not interested. People are not interested. People are not interested in spending money. People are not interested in spending money. So you end up in a vicious cycle that you have a health crisis, economic crisis, the uncertainty generated by the health crisis is not allowing the economies of the world to grow. And if they don't grow, then health or no health crisis, people are going to suffer. So in that sense, I think we are at a very strange stage in the evolution of global politics. And what is also happening is that if you look around the world, you do see some very strange trends that while the rest of the world is suffering, a country from where it originated seemingly has been able to bring it under control. So, and its economy is on a better footing than the rest of the world. So I think there is the implications of this COVID-19 and its economic implications and its economic consequences. That the implications that will flow from this would be quite far-reaching for the global order. Some of the challenges we were already witnessing before the COVID struck us: shifting balance of power, rise of China, institutional collapse. But this crisis has aggravated those trends.
Professor Pant, since you have drawn us a broader perspective about the pandemic and its outcome on the global politics and global order, especially more about India as a country, as a regional power that way. We have been last year when the pandemic got in, we had our economy about to take a flight after a quarter or 2 quarters or 3 quarters of decline. Then we started our vaccine export because we thought that we had got over this virus. We earned a goodwill at the global level. But then we are in the middle of the second wave. We are caught into that web. Our healthcare infrastructure, especially in the Delhi capital that we come across, it has overwhelmed a lot. So is it like the vaccine maitri or the goodwill that we got out of that? Is it going to hurt that? Reason being that we are now importing the same vaccines or the different vaccines for that purpose.
There is certainly a lot of criticism that the government is drawing for export of vaccines. My own sense is that while the government should be and will be it should be held accountable for everything that has happened over the last few weeks, I would say. I would not call vaccine maitri or vaccine diplomacy as something that that deserves criticism. My own sense is that, look, we are all in unprecedented territory, right? When this crisis started, no one knew how this is going to emerge, how this crisis is going to shape, and how this crisis is going to evolve. So when the first wave struck us, and when India relatively got stabilized, you looked around the world and you saw countries that were withering under the onslaught of COVID-19. Now, India as the nodal actor in the global pharmaceutical chain, I don't think it would have been very responsible for India to say that, look, we are the world's global pharmacy. but we are not going to supply you vaccines. And, I think at that point in time, the assessment, it would have been a wrong assessment, certainly looking from what has happened. But the assessment was that as India moves into a gradual vaccination strategy, and by the way, that's gradual vaccination strategy is not unique to India. Every country in the world has followed a gradual vaccination strategy. That first you go for the most vulnerable, first you go for the senior citizens, then you go for 45 and above, and then you go for 18 to 44. In fact, in many countries, in some of the wealthiest countries, even today, the youngsters are not getting vaccines. So the graded approach to vaccination was a sensible thing to do given the circumstances we were facing. And the idea was that some other countries want these vaccines more than us. So there is no harm in exporting some of that stockpile. So I would not say that vaccine diplomacy itself, is responsible has been responsible for the second wave. I think what has been responsible is an inadequate infrastructure and an inadequate assessment of the threat that happened. And on both these counts, Indian state machinery failed. But I don't think Vaccine Matri as an initiative is something that has, that either would have solved the problem or is responsible for the present crisis.
Professor Pant, if we will be down 2 years from now, after the second wave recedes and then third wave and then consecutively 4-5 waves, after that, the whole geopolitical setup may look different that way, because the reason being economic slowdown, global supply chains have taken a big hit, and then investments in the new startups by any other country. We'll be looking at a different world then. Every nation will be placed differently. It's not peculiarly to the India that it has faced a pandemic and then it has faced a virus and then everything has gone downhill. What will be that world, world order? How will it look like after this pandemic is over?
World order, of course, has been changing, as I mentioned in response to the first question, even before COVID struck us. Now, my own sense is that the trends that were already visible we have seen an acceleration of those trends. Now, certainly one of the biggest trends that we find ourselves in the midst of is a rising China. Now, China was even rising before COVID, but now its ability to dictate terms to other countries, its seeming ability, it has increased even further. And given that while other countries are still struggling to come out of this crisis, China has relatively stabilized its situation, means that China will have a first mover advantage when it comes to the establishment of the new order post-COVID. However, what has also happened is that this crisis has revealed some of the fundamental questions about China's rise. So those questions that were prevalent even before China was rising are being asked more pointedly today. Whether China is going to be a responsible power, whether China is going to be part of the international order as we know it, whether China is willing to work with other countries. Because what we see right now is a China that is intent on challenging other countries, that is intent on brandishing threats, that is intent on very rude diplomacy, wolf warrior diplomacy, etc. So we are looking at a country that is making other countries uncomfortable, and as a result, we are seeing a lot of shift happening in terms of partnerships, in terms of coalition building, in terms of minilateralism. And so, the idea of Quad, the idea of other trilaterals in the Indo-Pacific has gained traction in the last few years. In the last year and a half, we have seen great degree of traction on these issues.
Professor.
So that's one aspect of the changing geopolitical environment where we are going to see a lot of flux. The other related to it are, of course, this what happens to the multilateral order, what happens to institutional framework in the world, and finally, what happens to the way we to global governance issues via the institutional mechanisms that are available. Do we need completely new mechanisms? because it seems that organizations like even WHO are not working the way they should be. So I think the challenges have been revealed. The challenges, the discussions that were more academic before COVID-19 struck us have become much more real, and various countries will have to adapt themselves to it.
Professor, this brings us to the very fundamental question about the outcome of this pandemic, and then allegations of the virus being started from the Wuhan. The US India greater conversion of interests that speak for themselves when it comes to the recent Quad summit that has happened. Is it like after that 2008 India nuclear deal 123 agreement? Is it like that India and US are on a growing trajectory of their bilateral relations, or how will Quad play out with vis-a-vis India-China relations, given the fact that the trade conflict, the trade disputes between US and China that way, and then fundamentally, is it like that by the virtue of the Quad, things between India and China have not been able to get that way along on the lines of India-US relations? I would like to have your take, sir, on this India and US greater convergence of the interests in the region and across.
See, Indo-US relations, India-US relations have been converging ever since the end of the Cold War. So, once the Cold War ended, the two democracies have been engaging at multiple levels. It is a relationship driven as much by the state, by the two governments, as it is driven by more organic people-to-people contacts. Our student community, migrants, Indian diaspora. There's a soft power approach, the democratic values, etc. So there are a whole host of issues why India and the US have been coming together. What has accelerated the trend is, of course, the changing structural reality, which means that the rise of China presents challenges to India, it presents challenges to America, and both would like certain stability in the wider Indo-Pacific, and therefore the two nations have been working together. You talked of the US-India nuclear deal. That was a manifestation of the fact that the two countries were growing increasingly strategic in their orientation and decided to take an issue, the nuclear issue, out of this engagement where the two countries were willing to work together on a very, very contentious issue and decided to resolve that issue to the satisfaction of both sides, and that has given the relationship another level of momentum. So what perhaps I think is interesting to look at in the India-US relationship is that irrespective of who the government is in Delhi and irrespective of which administration is in power in Washington, the relationship has only got strengthened. That in that sense, the relationship speaks about the fundamental strategic convergence between the two. Now, China, of course, is today one of the most important challenge that the two nations face, and therefore they are trying to resolve it, trying to work to see what can be done about it in terms of managing China in the Indo-Pacific. Quad or no Quad, I don't think Quad is the problem in India-China relations. Quad is a manifestation of the problem in India-China relations. Quad is a reflection of that problem. Quad is not a source of that problem in India-China relations. India-China relations have been diverging, have been growing. India and China have been growing apart for various sets of reasons. And Quad reflects a way to address the question of changing balance of power in the region, and not so that it does not get tilted. It does not get tilted in favor of China to a great extent. So, and Quad is still, one may recall that Quad started in 2007, but then it was discarded, and then suddenly in 2017 it was resurrected, precisely because Chinese behavior from 2007 to 2017 became much more aggressive. So I think we are likely to see greater movement on Quad because China's attempt to shape the behavior of other countries in a very aggressive manner is generating counter reactions, and Quad is one of the counter reactions.
Fine, sir. Then, Professor Pant, we would like to have your take on the for the viewers and for the students of international relations and foreign policy, especially. Will you draw for us that a bit of historical background of the India-China relations since last 2-3 decades, so that we'll come to the next topic about it. That historically, if things between India and China, particularly in the region, were based on mutual trust, on the economic ties, and on the people-to-people contact, what actually went wrong in between this? A bit of history to it will make it clear for the viewers and the students, especially, sir.
See, I think trust in India-China relations was always lacking. And what the leadership, especially in India, tried to do was to ensure that that lack of trust does not result in outright rivalry. And so the attempt was to find areas of convergence to work with China. So you can go back, see, the only time when India and China actually were converging significantly was in the early post-independence days of Asian solidarity and Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai. After that, it was all downhill. So you had the 1962 war, which was seen as a great betrayal by many in India. And then the whole issue of boundary, the whole issue of structural change during the Cold War, where China and Pakistan and America became very close to each other, and India was on the other side of the equation, seemingly led to a very strange dynamic where till late 1980s, India and China were in relative stasis. There was no real movement on either side. And the boundary issue was, of course, there. By late 1980s, the consensus was that let us build a relationship with China based on this assessment that while boundary relations, border question will always remain there, but it cannot be the sole determining factor in the relationship. So let's try to build economic ties. Let's try to see if we can cooperate on global platforms, etc. So, and that led to a different interpretation of the relationship. So by the end, when the Cold War ended and post-Cold War period started, you started having these engagements between China and India, and which one of them, bilateral engagement on economics, on trade, as well as a very interesting initiative called the Russia-China-India Trilateral, which talked of standing up to the West or America's unipolarity. So in that sense, India and China started engaging with each other, or tried to engage with each other at a global level, tried to find convergence at the global level, so that their bilateral differences cannot become or do not seem insurmountable and do not become conflict-ridden. Now, that if you look at how the relationship has been managed, by and large, all governments in India have followed that template, till very recently. Now, I think what has happened, and I think where the shift has started happening, is what happened last year, which is the Galwan Valley incident, where for the first time we saw violence happening. Now, the border issues were, sharpening for the last several decades because China was getting bolder along the border. It was building its infrastructure, so therefore it felt that it had the ability to project power along the border with India. But by the time you had 2020 and Galwan Valley incident, that has sort of made it very clear to many in India that China has an agenda that it is going to pursue at the expense of its relations with India. So India relations are not that important, because an assumption of India policy was that China would feel that India is important enough to be engaged with, and therefore bilateral issues, while difficult, will remain on an even key. But that has not happened. We are seeing growing assertion by China. We are seeing growing assertion by China on the border, on various issues around India, on various issues on the global platforms. And I think that has made India bit more circumspect about its China policy. And so you see this dramatic shift. You see that, in the past we were hedging on Quad. Now we are no longer hedging on Quad. In the past, India was reluctant to develop partnerships. India is now no longer reluctant to develop partnerships with countries that may have similar worldview. India also, is making it very clear that the old template where the border issue can be, we can keep talking about the border issue and at the same time enhancing our trade and economic ties and people-to-people ties. That template is not going to work. If China wants a resolution, if China wants to move forward in its relations with India, then it will have to make changes to its border policy with India. But we have not seen any impact of that happening, and so we see a lot of shift in India's policy on trade and technology. On 5G, for example, India has decided not to invite Chinese companies. India is restricting Chinese entry into certain critical sectors. So all that is happening at a time when India and China relations are perhaps at their lowest. And given the challenges that this relationship faces, it does not look like they're going to improve anytime soon.
Fine enough, sir. If we talk broadly about, realistically, if we talk about China, it's expanding. It has a robust economy of trillions of dollars, and it is out with what it calls itself as a wolf warrior diplomacy tools, and then it's messing up with the international norms of maritime boundaries, especially in the South China Sea. How is it going to play out if China post this pandemic? How is it going to play out with the nations that respect the rule-based order of the world erected upon since a century now? What will be future prospects if China keeps growing this way? If China keeps being allegedly with the sort of expansionist mindset, how is it going to play out with the world politics and with the global order itself, sir?
Well, I think some of the evidence we are already seeing right now, where countries are uncomfortable with the Chinese behavior, and there has been a very interesting and dramatic shift in perception about China. And two cases, a few cases stand out. You have the US, you have European Union, and you have Australia, where till say 2 years back, the debate on China was that China needs to be managed, that that engagement with China is a good thing, that it is, we can't really push China beyond a point. I think today we are seeing an inversion of those policies. We are looking at a shift in the approach. And we are looking at both, whether it is European Union, whether it is US, and whether it is a country like Australia willing to push back on issues which China has taken undue advantage of. So we are looking at a larger, broader shift in perception about China's rise, and therefore the result is that you're looking at stronger diplomacy among like-minded countries. Quad is one manifestation, but there are several others like greater convergence in military matters, many trilaterals and minilaterals emerging in the Indo-Pacific, and also the very fact that you have a concept like the Indo-Pacific being acknowledged and accepted by a wide range of countries today. Remember, Indo-Pacific is something that China opposes. Indo-Pacific is something that China does not like. Indo-Pacific is something that a few years back China has said would disappear from the dictionary of global politics. Today, every country, most countries in the world, whether they are Europe or whether they are ASEAN, they have accepted the logic of the Indo-Pacific. And in that sense, it's a great big defeat for Chinese diplomacy, because Chinese argument has been pushed back by these countries. So the more China becomes aggressive and abrasive, the danger for China is that countries will also start pushing back, because I don't think we live in a world where aggressive policies like the ones China is pursuing will be looked at kindly and will be rewarded. So for a number of countries now, the question is, how far are we willing to go with Chinese economic largesse? Because China clearly is a major economic player, and it can lend money, it can give money, it can resort to all kinds of processes and structures. It can create those, like it Belt and Road Initiative to push its own economic and geoeconomic agenda. But for many countries, the question is how can we engage with China on economics at the same time push back on the strategic matters? It's a very difficult question, not an easy one. All countries are struggling to figure it out. But I think the challenge for China is becoming starker, because China is at the moment seemingly not willing to relent on its aggressive policies, and the world is also now more in the mood to push back.
Professor Pant, if we see, only yesterday I came across a survey that was conducted by some organization and was telecasted by Fareed Zakaria on his show on CNN. There is a bipartisan consensus that global public opinion is at an average going against China and its expansionism, be that with respect to its transparency, be that its data surveillance and surveillance over its citizens. There is an Achilles heel that we can possibly term it as an Achilles heel. Most of the people, most of the scholars talk about the middle income trap that China will be in the next coming years. And then its growing urbanization, reason being that it's an export-laden economy. So its energy needs on the outside world, and then its increasing surveillance of its citizens, massive pollution out of the massive urbanization that it's undertaking, huge sort of investments, especially what India calls as the pearl of string strategy, to demean the world rule-based order. How is it going to play with President Xi and the Communist Party of China?
See, there is no doubt that there are significant challenges that China faces, and in some would argue that perhaps Xi Jinping's aggressive foreign policy is ill-timed, because China should be managing first its own house, and therefore the challenges that you have mentioned, that others have mentioned elsewhere, should be a priority rather than pushing a very, very aggressive foreign policy. In fact, on BRI itself, Belt and Road Initiative, the massive infrastructure program, and there is a lot of discontent in China that, why is China investing so much or giving money to such an extent to other countries when it is needed at home? So I don't, I think it's a fair point to make that there are challenges that China faces. My only, submission would be that, look, I don't think domestic challenges in and of themselves can preclude China's rise. China has many, demography, urbanization, pollution, restructuring of its economy. There are a whole host of challenges. But let us also remember that in the past, we have seen emergence of great powers like Britain, like US, like Soviet Union, that were not perfect societies domestically. They all had their own problems. So it's possible that China may not ever be able to resolve these problems and yet emerge as a great power. And I think in terms of capabilities, China is very close to that. Economic, military, diplomatic, China has great heft today in global politics. I think the question that everyone should be asking is whether that role of China as a global leader or a global hegemon will be accepted by others. Because leadership is also about what others are willing to accept. And I think the more China behaves aggressively, therefore I come back to this point, its behavior will determine its great power legacy. I don't think the domestic challenges will determine its. Domestic challenges are there. I don't think you will ever reach a state where China is able to resolve all its domestic problems. But what will determine its trajectory as a major power, as a great power, will be is whether its role as a stakeholder is accepted by others. And at the moment, it is not being accepted. And therefore, my argument that the pushback continues against China, and that pushback has become stronger in the last 2 to 3 years. And that is what I think is important to underscore, that you have America, where there is bipartisan consensus on the challenge that America has to meet out to China. In Europe, there is now consensus. We have just had the investment treaty that Europe had signed that has now been stalled. In countries like Australia and Japan, of course, Japan is a is a historical rivalry with China, but in Australia, which was dependent on China on economy, is now saying, well, we can't continue with this. In India, where many in India were saying, look, we need to have a more positive relationship with China. China has made it virtually impossible now for anyone to stand up in India and say that China is going to be a partner. So I think China is really doing great damage to itself with the kind of policies it's pursuing, and that may derail its story as a rising power. I don't believe its domestic challenges will derail its story as a rising.
Fair enough, sir. Then I would like to have your take on the growing Sino-Russian aggressive resurgence in the region out of most of the things that are at interplay. How will the growing proximity between China and Russia, how is it going to affect the regional security architecture and the regional geopolitics, especially the regional power configurations in the larger region of Asia and West Asia and Asia as a whole? Sir, I'll have your take on that.
See, Sino-Russian, right? Sino-Russian relationship, of course, today is very significant, and both countries feel that they have very few friends left in the world. And Russia, of course, because it is looking at the world, looking at its foreign policy through the prism of its antagonism with the West, finds in China an important partner. And for China, of course, Russia is an important partner because it gives China a certain legitimacy in global politics, which it otherwise would not have. Now, what is interesting is, I think, the way the Russia-China relationship has evolved. During the Cold War, it used to be the other way around, that Russia was the big brother and now China seems to be the big brother in the relationship. And that relationship, many had pointed out the problems in the relationship in the past. But that relationship has continued to grow because of the structural reality that we are facing today, where the world is getting divided into this, West versus non-Western powers, or West on the one side and Russia and China on the other. Now, India, of course, has a very important role here because India sits, at least in theory, India can bridge this divide. After all, India is also, if India is part of Quad, India is also part of BRICS. And we are going to have BRICS summit very soon in August. India is hosting BRICS summit. So there is a issue there about what role India can play. But insofar as Sino-Russian relationship is concerned, it has a logic of its own. It will continue to grow for the foreseeable future because both need each other vis-a-vis the West. West is the primary enemy, and the two nations are working together. What is interesting is that Russia seems to be giving up a lot of its options, especially in the Indo-Pacific, primarily because it is reliant on China so much. Because China is anti-Indo-Pacific, Russia has also become anti-Indo-Pacific. Now, there's no logic for Russia to do that, but the logic emerges from its foreign policy need of being on the right side of China, and that is being reflected in its approach. So I think by and large, the relationship will continue to grow without any fundamental difference in the way they look at the world. For Russia, of course, the contest between China and America is good because that gives Russia credibility in the eyes of China. And that also keeps America on tenterhooks as to how the Russians might behave. But I think the way this relationship has evolved, one can reasonably conclude that it is likely to continue.
Interesting, Professor Pant. I'll just now switch over to some of the questions about the West Asia. Professor Pant, since since the US withdrawal, decision of withdrawal from the Afghanistan has created a new sort of instability in Afghanistan particularly and in the region speculatively. Can we can we assume that it's going to be tough for the nations that are involved into the regional structure of the geopolitics because of the particularly because of the withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan? What are the prospects for India?
See, American withdrawal from Afghanistan certainly is going to be challenging because the region had got used to living under this presence, right? So for a long time, since 2001 now, um, the region has become used to the American presence. The region has become used to a certain kind of a stability that it was providing. So now that Americans are leaving, and by September 11th, that will be complete. The question for the regional stakeholders is what do they do about Afghanistan, frankly? And given the fault lines in Afghanistan, both within Afghanistan as well as regionally, within Afghanistan, you see this challenge between Taliban and the government. You see no resolution. You see Taliban continuing to be extremely violent on the ground. But at the same time, regionally, you see that countries in the region continue to look at Afghanistan very, very distinctly from each other. Pakistan, of course, has had a long-standing agenda in Afghanistan. India has, largely been favorable to Afghanistan's emergence as an independent nation state that can take care of its security and economic aspirations. That becomes a challenge once America leaves. And therefore, how do you reconcile these differences between various stakeholders would be a huge challenge. The so-called peace process in Afghanistan, that frankly is more process than peace, that has delivered so far more process than peace, I don't think it's going to give any sustainable solution to the problem. What it might give all of us is an intermediate resolution where countries that are where the stakeholders look at Afghanistan under the American pressure and come to some sort of an agreement for the time being. But whether that agreement would stay once Americans leave and who would manage that process, those are huge questions. And I don't think anyone has any answers at this point.
Fair enough, sir. One last thing, because we are running out of time. We already have ran actually. And one last thing, I'll have your perspective on this changing West Asian politics. Post the there was a kind of expectation, sort of positive vibes. Everybody who is interested in international relations as a student, they were expecting that there will be a kind of lasting peace post Abraham Accords. But then the clash and then the missile strikes that we have had in Palestine and then on the Israeli hinterland is the region again on the brink of uncertainty and instability, and how is Biden administration going to especially with the ceasefire agreement they actually backed, how is Biden administration going to be dealing with this West Asian issue, particularly of Israel Palestine, and how is how is the region going to get in the future course of time?
See, Middle East or West Asia is always very difficult to predict. In that sense, I think when you started off this question saying that everyone expected stability. I don't know. I think there are two problems in Middle East, right? The one issue is the Israel-Palestine issue. The other issue is the Arab versus Israel issue, an Arab world and the Israel. What Abraham Accords did was to make the growing relationship between the Arab countries or a lot of the Arab countries and Israel more formalized, more public. But the Palestinian question was not in the picture. So the current crisis or the recent crisis was all about Israel and Palestine. It had nothing to do with the Arab world, in fact, in that sense. So I think there are two parallel issues here, where we are seeing, this greater synchronization between Israel and the Arab world in general. So even when you are looking at UAE, Egypt, Jordan, of course, being the older partners of Israel, and now you have UAE, Bahrain, etc., joining the relations, opening up relations with Israel. And of course, informally, Saudi Arabia also moving into that category. On the one side, partly because of their fear of Iran and Iran's growing role in the Middle East, and Iran's use of proxies in the Middle East. So you see this divide expanding and this divide becoming more prominent. And this will have its own set of consequences. I think we are finding some of those consequences being reflected in the Israel-Palestinian question. So, Hamas is so powerful today because Hamas has the backing of Iran. And the Arab world has no sympathy for Hamas because they don't feel any need to have any sympathy. You have Fatah, on the other hand, which is more the Arab world's creation. So in that sense, the dichotomy in the whole Middle East, the fault lines in the Middle East are becoming too intertwined between the larger questions of the region and the Israeli-Palestinian question, and the ability of America to impose anything or to push for a diplomatic resolution is weakening for two reasons. One, America is just not interested. Americans are interested elsewhere. Their strategic interests lie in China, Indo-Pacific. They want to think about those things because they matter. That's what matters in a strategic sense for them. The other issue is, of course, that traditional American reliance on Middle Eastern oil has declined. America is no longer importing oil from the Middle East. It's other countries. So you have countries like India and China that are now the major importers from Middle East. So the question, therefore, for the world is, there is no big player that is invested in resolving the issues, especially the Israeli-Palestinian issue. The Arab world has given up. They are more concerned about Iran than they are about Palestinians. The Palestinians themselves are divided between Fatah and Hamas. Hamas, being a terror group, technically, has also no locus standi for many countries. Many countries believe that they should not support Hamas in its fight with Israel. And so you have a situation that is very, very combustible. It can blow up anytime. And Israel, of course, is pushing in the issue of Jewish settlements and in the Palestinian territories that has generated a sense of angst. And that is being reflected in the way the situation is developing. So if you bring in all these factors together, it makes for a very, very combustible problem in the region. And unfortunately, because there is no momentum towards any sort of diplomacy, and there is no push towards any sort of diplomacy, I don't see anything happening anytime soon. I mean, whatever evidence we have so far, it tells us that Biden administration is not particularly focused on Middle East. It was forced to do something about the crisis because crisis erupted. Otherwise, you would not have heard Biden on Middle East. Biden is more focused first on America itself, because you have the problems within America, both pandemic, economic issues that we were talking about earlier, as well as reviving America's leadership in what we were talking in the second half of this engagement on China. So Biden has very little space for Middle East. Of course, Middle East will continue to erupt and it will continue to force America to respond. But unless there is a drive, unless there is a push for sustained diplomacy, I think we will always live or move from one crisis to another.
Thank you, Professor Pant, for in the first place accepting our invitation out of your tight schedule, and will be enlightening us very much that way. We'll keep inviting you on our next podcast, and till then, thank you from the viewers in advance, and thank you from me individually, because it was nice to hear you, and we got so much enlightened out of this. So this is all for today from State of Affairs. I'll take your permission, sir, and then we'll go off air. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.